So today we're going to be talking about secondary dominants and secondary leading tone chords. So effectively, a secondary dominant is being used to intensify. One point that could serve to clarify this. So if we look at this slide, what we have is a chromatic voice exchange. Now, the chromatic voice exchange is actually occurring in this second example. So right here, starting with a 4/6 chord. And what you're looking for the chromatic voice exchange is two different voices changing, but one of them will move chromatically. So if we look at this, we have A, G, and F sharp. Here we have an F natural, G, and an A. So this intermediary 6/4 chord is serving to connect the voice exchange, but what we effectively have is this A changing voices with the A up here, and then this F changing voices with the F sharp down here. So that is actually permissible, and it's an ideal way to create this particular chord progression. So when you do have a voice exchange with a 5/7/5, as you can see, it looks very similar to the minor 2/6/5. The only difference is the raised fourth scale degree. So you have sharp 4 in the bass, but otherwise this entire progression looks identical to the previous one. So when you're writing these, this kind of shows you how you can substitute the secondary dominant for the 2 chord. So when resolving secondary dominants, they can resolve to a 7th chord, and this is a little bit unusual because typically what I've told you in the past is that in the classical romantic period we typically don't have 1/7 chords, and if you do see one, it means something special is going on or something unusual is going on. In this case, it's the fact that we're in a secondary key area. So since we're in a secondary key area, we are not in the primary key, so that leading tone tendency to resolve up isn't as strong, because we're only really concerned with the leading tone of the primary key. Because of this, the F sharp can actually resolve down in this case. So the F sharp is your leading tone. You'll notice this is scale degree 4 in the key of C, so it's sharp 4 going down to natural 4 and then going down to a 3 above the bass. So this is a perfectly legitimate way to resolve the leading tone with a secondary dominant. And the only reason you do it is effectively, if you're in the key of C, we're going to tonicize G major. So that gives you your D dominant chord, D, F sharp, A, and C. And that's going to resolve to a 5/7, which is a 1/7 in the key of G. And in order to create that 7th, the leading tone has to resolve down by a half step. So you see it in all 3 examples. The only difference is right here, the leading tone actually gets a chance to resolve up before coming down to the 7th, because you have a triad moving to the 7th. So this shows you pretty clearly how you can actually resolve a 5/7/5 to 5/7. And how if you were to resolve it, if there wasn't a 5/7 chord on the second beat, you could just resolve it to a triad using the normal tendency tone resolution. Notice that the 7th is still coming down, so that has not changed. So let's go ahead and listen to these 3 chord progressions. Second one, and the third one. So all 3 chord progressions effectively give you a stronger 5/7/1 cadence in the primary key, and then that 5/7 is actually tonicized a bit. But we wouldn't call this a tonicized perfect authentic cadence. We only really refer to a tonicized cadence when it's a half cadence. So the 5/7/5 can also be expanded by using a cadential 6/4 pattern. The same voice leading is going to be used within the tonicized key area. And if you see this example, it shows the tonicized half cadence moving from 1/6 to 5 in the tonic key. Now there are some issues with this progression, which I've provided here so that you can kind of find the solutions and practice some of your part writing skills. But let's take a look at the the half cadence first. In the key of C, this is a 1/6 chord. If we skip over this measure entirely, we get a 5 chord in the key of C. So between this measure and this measure, we get a half cadence. Now, it is then tonicized, the half cadence is tonicized by this cadential 6/4. So what's happening here is you have your 1 chord in the key of G, so you've got your G, your B, another B, and your D, and then it resolves down to a 5 chord in the key of G, so you've got your D, F sharp, A, and C, and then that comes down, and these two units, sort of the tonicization in the key of C and the half cadence in the key of C, they merge together into a 1 chord or a tonicized half cadence. So the way we could illustrate this is with a bracket underneath and then a 5 chord right here to indicate that we are tonicizing the 5 chord of C major. So there's a few problems with the progression. The first one, if you haven't figured out yet, please pause the video and come back and I'm going to give you the answers. But the first issue is actually the spacing. Right here between C and C, that's an octave. So that's the largest interval we want to have between the upper 3 voices. We just barely squeaked by with an octave. Here you have a tenth. So now a tenth is too far away from the alto. This tenor and alto, there's just too much space. It's going to create a less effective chord progression. So then that continues with the C, and then it continues with the D. The tenor, which is down here, and the alto up here, they're too far away from each other. That's your first issue. There's one other issue as well. This is your 7th, your tonicized 7th, if you will, and it is resolving up. What it needs to do is resolve down to a B. So you wouldn't want to double the 3rd. So we've also got an issue with this A coming up to the B here. So what you need to do is resolve this C down to a B and this A down to a G. So let's go ahead and listen to this progression the way it's written, and then I'll show you how you can actually fix it. I'll give you an example. If you listen to that, you can hear all that space between these two voices. It just feels empty in the middle part. So it feels like a hollow progression. And that's why we try and keep our spacing somewhat consistent so that we can get the best possible chord progression here. Now, if we look here, this is a proper way to write it. So all I did was I took everything down an octave. There could be other solutions as well. You could invert these two voices where the G comes down below, and then that would solve the voice leading issues as well. But I chose to take everything down an octave. We made the C here a unison, and then we get a resolution of the 7th, and the B comes down to an A. And we're actually going to hear this first progression again the way it's written. Now listen for these middle voices. Just try and hear how it sounds just a little bit hollow. So here we go. I'm going to play it again. I suggest getting to a piano and playing this progression and then playing this progression so you can hear the difference between the two. So now we're going to talk a little bit about tonicization and tonicized half cadences. I have been talking about this throughout the lecture, but now we're going to get a little more official. So tonicization occurs when a new key center is temporarily established within a phrase. It usually occurs at the end of the phrase towards the cadence. So unlike a modulation, the tonicization only occurs for a brief period. So if we just had one measure where we had a 5, 6, 5, a 5, it resolved to 5, and then it continued in the primary key, that would be a tonicization because we only had this removal of the primary key for one chord, essentially. It was just a secondary dominant. Now if that secondary dominant resolves to the 5, and then you hear a 1, 4, 5, 1 progression in the new key, so our secondary key area, then all of a sudden we most likely have a modulation. So a tonicization is temporary. It lasts for about one measure. A modulation lasts for several measures, and it may stay there for the rest of the piece. It's where we actually move into a new key and take up resonance, and we usually establish the new key with either a tonic, predominant, dominant tonic, or at least a tonic, dominant tonic in the new key to show that we have actually modulated. A tonicized half cadence occurs when there is a half cadence in the primary key, so you move from 1 to 5 in the key of C, but then that 5 chord is tonicized by a secondary dominant, so it's tonicized by another key area. That's called a tonicized half cadence. So these are many of the ways that you can actually write and voice your secondary dominants. Notice that for the entire first row, the leading tone is resolving up, and we don't have any sevenths in this first row, but we also always double the root of the chord. So this is doubled, the D is doubled, the D is doubled, D is doubled, D is doubled, and then the D is doubled here as well. The other thing you should note is that when you have an inversion, it's okay to skip down so that you can have that complete chord there. When we get into seventh chords, it's the same rules as with regular seventh chords, moving from 5-7 to 1 or 5-6-5 to 1. When you have a 5-6-5 or a 4-3 or a 4-2, which would be very unusual, but when you have those, you want to use complete chords. So we've got D, F sharp, A, and C. So all 4 chord members are there. The leading tone comes up by step, seventh comes down, maintain your common tone, resolve the remaining voices. That's pretty straightforward. You should know how to do this already. If you don't, go back and watch one of the earlier lectures on how to actually resolve your dominant seventh chords. So where it gets a little bit weird is where we have sort of this 2 chord moving to a 5-7, a 5 to 5. You can move chromatically. So if you want to move from an F, from the 2 chord, which is your third of the chord, and then you want to move to F sharp, which is the leading tone of the 5-7 chord, and then you want to resolve up to G, that's perfectly fine. So this ends up being scale degree 4, sharp 4, up to 5. But what would not be okay is if you moved between different voices. So you want to try and keep any chromatic motion within the same voice. Here's an example of a chromatic voice exchange. So the F is exchanging with the F sharp, and the D is exchanging with the D. This is okay because it's a true voice exchange. If it was a cross relation, so the F changed with the F sharp, and the D did not change with the D, that would be less desirable. You'd want to avoid that. And then here, the final example, it shows you how you can have sharp 4 in the bass, and you can leap into it. That's okay, but only in the bass. You don't want to do it in any other voice because it draws attention to it. The bass line creates this strong leading tone resolution though, and it ends up sounding okay to our ears. One of the things that you should note that while these are all strong secondary dominants, if you add a seventh, it creates an even stronger resolution. And the other thing that you should keep in mind is that an inversion, such as a 5-6-5, the 5-6, 5-4-3, that's going to weaken the progression. But it also might provide for for smoother voice leading. So this F sharp going to the G, that's real smooth stepwise voice leading. So that might be preferred. So you kind of have to take your pros and cons into account when deciding what progression you actually want to use in a chord progression. So your basic rules for resolving secondary dominants. You want to resolve the leading tones up unless you're doing one of those exceptions where you have a 5-7 to 5 going to a 5-7. Cross relation should be avoided. So remember F to F sharp, and it's not going from D to D. If you make it a full voice exchange, it's okay. I always thought of a cross relation and a voice exchange. I thought of them in this way. With a voice exchange, 2 voices are switching places. With a cross relation, what's happening is only one voice is switching places and the other one is not. So it's like a cross relation is half a voice exchange. So we look at measure 111, chromatic motion, in the same voice. This is sharp 4, 4, down to 3. That's your 5, 4, 3 of 5 going to that 5, 7. That is okay. And then leaping into sharp 4 is also okay in the bass for measure 114. So again, when resolving 5, 7 of 5, the leading tone can resolve down to create smooth voice leading into the chordal 7th of the 5, 7. So leading tone effectively is resolving down to this F natural. And then this leading tone, the F sharp, is resolving down to an F natural. And just keep in mind that the 5, 7 of 5 to 5, 7, it creates a 1 major minor 7 chord in the tonicize key. And that's not something that we would typically see in the primary key area. You're not going to have a 1 major minor 7. First of all, if you had a 1 major minor 7, it would probably be a major 7. So we want to avoid that. And just keep in mind that when resolving from 5, 7, 5 to 5, 7, keep the scale degree sharp 4, natural 4, 3 in the same voice. So that's measure 117. All that chromatic motion staying in one voice. The next thing we can talk about are secondary leading tone chords to 5. You can also have secondary leading tone chords, and you spell them the exact same way as you would a secondary dominant. So you start with the dominant of the key, and you use that dominant to serve as a temporary tonic. So if you're in the key of C, G, because this 5 tells us what note to use as a temporary tonic, that's going to be our secondary key area. So then you just go to the 7th scale degree of G, which is F sharp, and you can build a leading tone chord, or a secondary leading tone chord is what we'd actually call it. So you'd have this leading tone chord of 5, or a secondary leading tone chord. Here is an example of a 7 half diminished 6, and then here is an example of a 7 half diminished 7 of 5. So if we play each of these examples, you can actually hear how one of these sounds more stable than the other. So I'm going to let you listen to these, and listen carefully for measure 1, 2, and 3. Measure 2, and measure 3. So of those 3 chords, did you hear it? Did you hear how the first one sounded really dissonant, and the third one sounded really dissonant, and the second one felt smoother? Let's go ahead and listen to these one more time and hear how the root position leading tone chord here and here emphasize the dissonance, whereas this one seems just a little bit smoother. If you can't hear it, get to a piano and play these chords, and you'll hear that this one's actually the smoother of the 3. So when you're resolving your secondary leading tone chords, you're essentially using the same basic principles as when resolving your secondary dominants. So your sharp 4 can resolve down just as with the 5 of 5. So you'd have sharp 4, 4, 3, and here we have an example, measure 123 and 124. It's still sharp 4, 4, and 3. Here's an example of how you can actually resolve it. You can have the leading tone go up and then come down to the 4. That's acceptable as well. You want to avoid the diminished fifth to the perfect fifth. Right here, see how we have a diminished fifth, the F sharp to the C, that's a diminished fifth. And then it resolves to G and D, that's a perfect fifth. It's only okay in the inner voices. If you put it in the outer voices, it draws attention to it, and it's too much dissonance. So we need to hide that dissonance in the inner voices. You also want to avoid the augmented second that could occur from scale degree flat 3 to sharp 4. There's not an example of that here, but that's just good voice leading. You always want to avoid that augmented second. And then double the third of the secondary leading tone triad. So in that case, you always want to try and double the third. So our third is going to be an A. So notice how it's doubled. Here's your A. It's doubled again. In this case, we did not double it because we were going for a complete chord, it looks like. You can't double it anytime you have a seventh because you want to use all four chord members. But whenever you have a triad, you should double that third of the secondary leading tone triad. So anytime you need to double a chord tone with a diminished triad, this is a review, you should double the third if possible. Your second best option would be to double the fifth. You don't want to double the root because that emphasizes the tritone between the root and the fifth of the chord. So you can also resolve to other scale degrees. So here we have a 5/7 of 2, 5/7 of 3, 5/7 of 4. With the 5/7 of 2, all you do is you go to the second scale degree of whatever key you're in. So if you're in the key of C, second scale degree is D. You build a 2 chord based on the quality of that second scale degree. So here we have D, it's doubled, F, and then effectively we probably want to have an A in there as well in most cases, but this one leaves out the fifth, which is fine. And then you just create a 5 chord on the second scale degree. So we're in the key of D, your 5 chord's A major, so A, C sharp, E, and G. So we've created this secondary leading tone chord on scale degree 2. If you go to scale degree 3 in the key of C, that's going to be an E minor chord. So here we have E, 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 and G, and we left out the fifth because we're creating a complete 5/7 chord, and then you just build a 5/7 on E. So the fifth of E is B. So you've got B, D sharp, F sharp, and A. So this one's a little weird. You're not going to see a 5 of 4, and there's a good reason for it. 5 of 4s could occur, but they're going to be very ambiguous. They don't really sound like a secondary dominant. What they sound like is just your basic 4 chord. So if you resolve from the 5/7 of 4 to 4, you hear the 4 chord strongly here, but in the key of C, without the 7th, this just sounds like a 1 chord. So it sounds like you're moving from 1 to 4. You add the 7th and suddenly it goes outside of the key, and then you can hear, oh, okay, this is a secondary dominant. So the 5/7 of 4 is effectively going to build a 1 chord in the primary key, and then if you have a 7th, you just make that 7th minor. The 5/7 of 6, same thing. You go to the 6th scale degree of C, which is A, and then you build a dominant chord on A, which is going to be E, G sharp, B, and D. So what we want to do when we build secondary dominants or secondary leading tone chords, we never want to tonicize a diminished triad. We only want to tonicize a major or a minor triad. And that's because we're trying to tonicize a key. We don't have diminished scales. We have major and minor scales. Okay, some of you might be thinking, no, there are diminished scales, and yes, you're right. But in the classical romantic period, we only have major and minor tonalities. We don't have diminished key centers. So while there is a diminished scale, we don't have diminished keys. And so we only want to tonicize a key that works. So in minor, you could actually tonicize the 7th scale degree, but in major, you can't. So this is just a good reference for you to kind of see the various resolutions you can have. And then notice you can also use a secondary leading tone chord to tonicize scale degree 2, scale degree 3, 4, 6, or 7. The 5 chord technically wouldn't be tonicized in a minor key unless you raise it, like I showed you in the previous example. So you can typically tonicize just about any scale degree when you're dealing with a secondary leading tone chord. You can tonicize any scale degree with a secondary dominant with the exception of the leading tone chord. So these are all your options for secondary chords. And one point I will make, it's a question I often get, can you have a 5/7 of 5 where the 5 is a minor dominant? The answer is yes, Bach did it, and other composers did it as well. When you're dealing with a secondary key area, it's less important that you have that major tonality because it's a secondary key area. The primary key area still holds the most power in those keys and those situations. So yes, you can have a minor dominant that's been tonicized. So here are your rules. You should memorize these. This is an important slide, and I recommend that you just practice some of these chord progressions in several different keys so that you can get better at this.